Thanks, Amir. Well, thankfully, we're meeting here in Davos with a ceasefire finally in place in Gaza and a terrible, devastating war of over 15 months. It's changed the region, and in some ways it's changed the world. And Trump 2.0 actually facilitated the ceasefire. It's quite incredible that the deal that was finally agreed between Israel and Hamas and really brought in with the mediation and support of Qatar and Egypt, but the changed factor was the US factor. This is the same deal that 13 months ago, the Americans had said that they could pull off under a Joe Biden administration, but ultimately it was the Trump factor, Trump clearly saying there had to be a ceasefire before inauguration. That moment crystallizes what people are expecting under a Trump administration that comes with many lessons from its first stint at the White House, but also lessons learned of what can be possible in the Middle East. Of course, there's been a major change also in Syria, just a few weeks in now with a new administration in Syria, and really a shift in where Iran stands in the region. So looking at a Trump administration where Iran's strength through force, through brute force, often through militias and other nefarious means, having a real influence on the region. During the Trump administration, there was a maximum pressure policy that started to try to tackle some of these issues, was really put on hold during a Joe Biden administration, and now will come into force in a different light during a Trump administration. The one change is some of the main participants in the first Trump administration, like H.R. McMaster and other generals that were known to the region previously, are not there this time. So the military presence is less so in this Trump administration, and it's much more a business-focused administration or people who are going to be involved in the Middle East. And I think that's something people are looking to see what that means.
So, Mina, I'm going to come back to you to understand how has the Middle East changed between Trump 1 and Trump 2, and who are the new actors there, other than the US, who are now going to exert themselves in what transpires in the future. And I'm going to come back to you. And I'm also going to talk about the two-state solution, which now seems to be something that the majority of the countries in the world are endorsing quite loudly. And, you know, how does that change, in many ways, the Trump dynamic that was set out in his first presidency? But let me first turn to Patrick. Patrick, you can also give a quick take on Trump 1 and Trump 2, how you think about the changes that you are likely to see and what has not changed. But also, what are the early indicators in terms of the key foreign policy priorities or economic policy thinking, and of course, domestic policy issues that America always is consumed with?
Yeah, so start with the domestic scene and Trump. He's going into this inauguration in a very different way from the first inauguration. And you may have seen the Wall Street Journal's just leaked some details of the initial speech. Instead of American carnage, we have a kind of optimistic can-do message for America. A much more convincing election victory for Trump than the previous result, which was contested. And there are strong signs that in some elements, the American public is quite strongly behind his agenda. For example, immigration and also the culture wars, gender and so on, where Trump's values are actually probably closer to the American average than President Biden. And that gives him, in some ways, a strong domestic mandate. In terms of the domestic priorities, just to start off, I mean, I think what we're going to see is the method has changed to reflect that increased confidence and, let's be honest, that improved mandate. And we're going to see a flurry of executive orders that will instantly sort of test the capacity of American institutions on immigration. We could see stuff on TikTok effectively overruling a congressional judicial decision. We could see states of emergency declared on various things, including trade. So he's going to go for it fast and big in a confident way. If I could turn to the foreign policy side of things, I think, again, it's a stunningly different picture for several reasons. One is that the world is colossally more dangerous than when he was first in office. We have two wars still going. I'm not as optimistic as you on the ceasefire. So two wars still going. We have what I call the 3 A's: anarchy in some parts of the world, see Sudan, the access of autocracies cooperating more, and then in some cases this new problem of asymmetry. See the Houthis, where the American power is unable to cope with them. And I think he's coming in at a time when American deterrence has collapsed around the world. People are simply not as intimidated by the superpower. So what will Trump do on foreign policy? Think American New York real estate tactics. When you're a company that's overburdened and strained, you do one of two things. You escalate, or in US real estate terminology, you kill the dogs. You get rid of the weak obligations you have. And that framework, I think, will apply to how Trump views problems around the world.
And the fourth A, the Atlantic consensus. How is the EU-US relationship going to pan out?
Well, it's one of the test case, and it's obviously going to be, really difficult. I mean, I see the Trumpian agenda essentially as a more comprehensive and forceful expression of American power on a much more limited geographic scope. So the more forceful expression of power includes things like renouncing international borders, which has happened in the last few days, and also the use of technology platforms to influence public opinion in other democracies, which is what we've seen with Musk and co over the last few weeks. So much more forceful use of American power, but at the same time retracting the geographic remit of America away from the idea it controls the whole world to a much more selective evaluation of its interests. Now, where is battleground number one for that set of issues? It's Europe, and Ukraine, of course, is the catalytic event that will show American commitment.
I'm going to come back to Ukraine. I think that's an important question, and also it's interesting to take a look at the list of leaders who are attending the inauguration, and that's something to reflect on as well. So I'll come back to you on that, Patrick. Let me turn to Sam. Sam, a quick take on Trump 2.0 from you, because it's only fair that you state your thinking on that. But I would also ask you to reflect on how do we actually assess what's happening in the US in this new presidency when it is certain that the media is not going to report as it is. The media is so biased, so polarized, it's actually impossible for us to understand what's happening in the US. And we probably have to turn to Mina Al-Oraibi in the UAE to understand what's happening in American politics. So how do you respond to that?
I recommend everyone turn to Mina, so I won't discourage that. First of all, Samir, thank you for stepping in and taking over this conversation. And thank you to the World Economic Forum for having us, but most of all, for having an exquisite sense of humor by asking us to say what's going to happen in the Trump administration. So we are 3 hours away from the inauguration. Those who remember the first day of his presidency, he had one executive order. His team is telling reporters he will have 200 by the end of the day. So just on that scale, the Trump presidency could be a factor of 200 times more unpredictable, more volatile than the first term. I think what I'll be watching for are where these points of tension arise. So for instance, we've talked about his mandate. This is a Republican who won more votes from Black Americans than anyone since Gerald Ford. He won more votes from Latino Americans than anyone since George W. Bush. As a Republican, 9 out of 10 counties voted more for Trump than they did the last time. And yet, while his popularity has grown, and those of us in the US media told you that was impossible, that this man had a ceiling, he couldn't get more popular, and yet now we see he's about 50-50 when it comes to approval ratings. A lot of his ideas are not popular. And so that is a really important point of tension, that Americans have gravitated towards this president, but there are plenty of his ideas they've not gravitated towards. Americans in large majorities oppose the idea of removing birthright citizenship. That's something the president and his team has discussed. In large majorities, they recognize that tariffs will increase the prices of goods, so that's good that Americans understand economics. And they also oppose the shrinking of the social safety net. And I don't quite understand how the president and his allies are going to approach this massive cut to government spending while also preserving the social safety net. Those things are in tension. And the other big point of tension, I think, for this president-elect, he'll be a president in about 3 hours, is the fact that he ran on a pro-growth agenda, and he has anti-growth policies. And so we have to see how these two things are going to play out. I think that's really important. And I should say to the question about the US media, I think an underappreciated factor here, and I say this obviously with my own biases, is how much President-elect Trump still values the legacy media, even in a world of these rising platforms. Time, where I work and I'm proud to work, spent more time with the president than anyone else during this election year. He spent a lot of time talking to us, as did his team. He still cares very much, I think, about two things. One, what the markets tell him, and two, how the legacy media is covering him. So even while we see these disruptive forces, even while we see this amazing growth of international media, I do think he will still be looking towards publications like Time, publications like the New York Times and others to understand how he's doing and what's acceptable and what's not.
No, so let me, since you have raised this important point, let me ask you the question on X, the former Twitter platform, and the power of podcasts and the Rogans and others who today command millions of viewership. So how difficult from a media perspective is it engaging with a leadership or a presidency like Trump? Are you guys resetting your organization to be in many ways more agile and more nimble to deal with someone like him?
Time had the opportunity to sit down with Joe Biden this year too, which very few people did. But this is an administration that likes talking to the press, that believes in having conversations and exchanges, that is in fact operates in a very open way. So I would say judge them by their actions and not their words. Are they spending time? Are they giving briefings? Are they giving information? Obviously the drama of the first presidency was a major focus for the press, but I think it's important while certainly there are legal issues and certainly there are threats against free speech in America, and certainly the president attacks the press, he also really loves the media, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
In fact, the vice president-elect at that time was, before the elections, was making it a point to actually go to those big legacy media houses that were considered to be not necessarily favorable. Patrick, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two different questions you're asking, right? One is the extent to which the administration cooperates actively with the press and observes the norms. And the answer is it will to a degree, but based on the behavior last time, I think it will be in some respects quite hostile, and we've already seen media owners of various flavors try to curry favor with the administration, which sends you quite a strong signal about what they expect to happen. The other question is what extent the media gives an accurate guide to what's happening in America. And I think, again, we've had a pretty disappointing election campaign in that respect. The polling system, which is often run by media companies, has proven again to be really quite inaccurate. And the base assumption was that Biden was fit enough to be elected. That turned out to be wrong, and I think that's a huge failing on the part of the media, really, the establishment media. And then also that it's then bigged up Kamala Harris, which proved to be a bad decision, and then again didn't really anticipate Trump. So I think the legacy media has a big problem, and it's coming at a time when the disruption of the business model rumbles on for the big media houses. Does that mean I'm pessimistic about free speech and truth in America? Not really, because it's the largest, most vibrant, most riotous arena for speech and ideas in the world too, and I think it's possible from that to kind of have a kernel of truth that still comes out. The one game changer I do think is the marriage of Musk and Trump, or at least maybe marriage is the wrong word, or maybe there'll be a divorce within a few weeks, but I think that is very important, and Zuckerberg's decision effectively to suspend these constraints and possibly the banning of TikTok, or as some kind of deal perhaps that creates an entity that's beholden to Trump in some way. And I think they will be using that media platform much, much more aggressively to try and influence public opinion in the US. But as I mentioned before,
also overseas.
Also overseas, and obviously places which don't have free media, China, Iran, Russia, for example, are largely immune from this. So paradoxically, it's actually the allies and democracies where the Trumpian distortion of...
If you were in Berlin, you would complain about something like this, for example.
Well, in fact, Chancellor Scholz already has. Yeah.
Correct. Mina.
But I would say it's also happening at a time when deep fakes have become much cheaper to produce and are proliferating. So actually, you know, independent of how the Trump administration is dealing with the media, there's going to be increased confusion, and the speed of fake news traveling, whether they feed into that or not, is really a challenge, and it's challenging media globally, not just, of course, the US. So it could, in some ways, actually help the legacy media, where people will come back to them to verify, did Trump actually say this, what would happen? It's incredible to see how Donald Trump has used direct access to audiences by using his own platform, or of course now with Musk and Twitter, but there will still be messaging. And I think we found that actually with the Trump administration, they do want to talk to the media, and they do go to the legacy media, actually much more than we found with the Biden administration.
So the role of the editor is perhaps even more pronounced today, because they have to make sense of all the noise that is available out
there. A panel of editors decides the only answer.
That's right, it is. That's right.
Look, I think it would be fair to discuss 3 international issues, since this is a global conference we are sitting at. Let's start with the most obvious one, the ceasefire in the Middle East. And Mina, I'll start with you, and I want both of your takes on how do you see this pan out, considering that Trump is not going to necessarily enjoy the same ability to move the capital to Jerusalem and forget about a geographical entity called Palestine. It is now real as part of any deal. And how does he navigate that?
So the fact that 75% of the member states of the UN today recognize the existence of a Palestinian state is, of course, a game changer compared to where we were previously. I think also in the Middle East, officials throughout the Middle East realize that this is an issue that really does need some sort of solution. And again, the fact that the ceasefire was put in place just before the inauguration of Donald Trump shows that they realize this is not something that they want hanging over their heads from day one, but it is a long road ahead. And to your point about being optimistic or pessimistic, absolutely, there's still so much that can go wrong. There's a ceasefire in Lebanon, there's a ceasefire in Gaza, and at any point that can go. And we still have, of course, a terrible situation in Yemen. And much more to go. But I think for the Trump administration, there is a sense of how powerful actually America can be when it chooses to use that power. And the one thing that is clear is the US remains the most important superpower. They've shown that in the Middle East. The American economy has knock-on effects globally, but again, with the Middle East. So I think actually geographically and the geographic reach of the US is much greater, with the difference that now, of course, the Afghanistan question is closed. And even though it was Donald Trump who said we need to withdraw, the shambolic withdrawal that happened from Afghanistan is really on the shoulders of the Biden administration, even if they try to shift blame. So I think that puts them in a position where they realize that they can move the needle, that there is interest in this, in the Middle East region, but also in Europe. And the fact that you have now a coalition between Norway and Saudi Arabia and others, European and Arab countries, trying to drive a two-state solution, that in some way can help the US not have to deal with the details and nitty-gritty, but actually own a deal and be able to say, we're able to drive this deal. So it's an important moment. And again, the dynamics with Iran, this can't be seen as separate from Iran. With what's happening in Syria and Lebanon, and the fact that you actually, the grip of Hezbollah and the grip of Iran in both Syria and Lebanon is something that Trump will want to champion. Let's not forget that his daughter's father-in-law is important Lebanese player now in this, and he can actually influence some of the dynamics. And again, I think that shows still the U.S. has incredible power over some of these dynamics.
I want to just jump in here. What's interesting, we asked President Trump just the week of Thanksgiving, we went down to visit him about how he thinks about Ukraine, how he thinks about the ceasefire. And as perhaps you could expect, there was a level of confidence when it comes to the Middle East. He said, oh, that's very easy. It's very easy. Ukraine's a little harder, but the Middle East is very easy. And so there is a kind of sense of comfort and confidence. It may be completely misplaced, but there is a real sense of, well, we can take care of that problem. And it was interesting over the course of a few weeks, there were developments that seemed to come in the administration's favor, at least the developments that they were supporting. And of course, he has promised that he'll solve the Ukraine-Russia war tomorrow. So I think that we talk about the Trump effect, there are limits to it. And so we can see in places where it has proved effective, or at least where the administration believe it's proving effective. And then there are other places where...
But Sam, if you were to be sitting in Europe today, and certainly if you were to be Zelensky...
I think we are.
That's right.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're in Planet Davos. We're not in Europe.
Okay, all right.
Planet Davos.
So in Europe today, and certainly in Central Eastern Europe,
yes,
there is a realization that you are looking at a bad deal.
I think what's interesting, one of our reporters who's great on Ukraine, Simon Schuster, talked to someone close to Zelensky at the end of the Biden administration and said, how do you assess the Biden administration's legacy when it comes to Ukraine? And the answer was, we don't know. History will tell. Now, America spent $183 billion on Ukraine. I do not anticipate that President Trump is going to spend the same amount supporting Ukraine. And so the fact that there's a sense of suspicion and discomfort with how the Biden administration handled Ukraine really makes me concerned about what, America's place is going to be in that conflict going forward.
Patrick.
Yeah, so first of all, on the Middle East, I think there's no doubt that Trump has made things better. As you've said, he seems to have been instrumental in getting the ceasefire. That doesn't mean one should be optimistic. And the reason is that what's been agreed, the first stage of the ceasefire, as you know, really doesn't answer any of the major questions. And it doesn't answer the question of, is it acceptable to Western powers or even the Gulf states to have Hamas still in control of Gaza, and that's the signal they're trying to send in the last few days that they are in control. It doesn't settle the crucial question for Israel of whether it retains a right to intervene militarily in Gaza under certain circumstances. And of course, it doesn't really address the fundamental and possibly irreconcilable set of views of both sides around a two-state solution. And bear in mind, at the moment, we have a government in Israel for now that is implacably opposed to that. So, the Trumpian vision of essentially some kind of cessation of violence between the Israelis and Palestinians, an alliance between Israel, America, and Saudi, and then using that to kind of impose conditions or intimidate or reduce the power of Iran is a compelling vision for the Middle East. It's just that I don't think we've really made a giant step towards it. On Ukraine, the picture, I think, is Russia continuing to cause enormous attritional damage to Ukraine, both in terms of sort of incremental terrain gains and casualties, and imposing acute strains on Ukraine's political system, including the legitimacy of Zelensky. And obviously, we all hope that President Trump does manage to negotiate some kind of deal that's on favorable terms to Ukraine. It's hard to see the leverage he has over Russia. I think possibly the only thing the US could do is try and impose much more draconian oil sanctions on Russia. But because of Trump's interest in the stock market and economy and inflation and so on, that may be something they're reluctant to. They could consider inducements for President Putin, release them from sanctions, give the foreign exchange reserves money back. And so on. But that would point more towards, I would say, a short-term deal that gets some kind of ceasefire and fighting to stop, but doesn't really solve the fundamental problems in the long run. And aren't those two situations really rather similar?
Patrick, I think you raise an important point, and we'll come back to the economy. I won't really speak about the energy business, the climate agenda, and of course, because that's a big topic at the forum. At Davos each year, and what happens to the IRA, what happens to the big plans, and certainly from a Middle East perspective as well. We hosted the COP28, and there was a big announcement around the green transitions. What happens with that? But before we come to that, let's talk China. That's the third international issue I really wanted to pose to all of you. The US-China relationship, and we see here all sorts of news, right? Making a trip to China, inviting Xi Jinping to the inauguration. What's happening here?
Well, I think this is the one area where I think if you look at the Biden administration, the record's actually quite good from an American interest point of view. They've rebuilt a system of alliances in Asia and renewed it. They've imposed a number of controls on China's economy, which seem to be doing serious damage to it, and have got in a position, I think, where America is appears to be the ascendant power, and China is stagnating. And if you go back to where we were 5 or 10 years ago, that's a pretty massive change. So Trump, in one sense, represents continuity, and in some sense, he's actually the intellectual author of the Biden policy. But I think we have very, very solid grounds to doubt his ability to apply over a sustained period of time that kind of strategy. One, because he likes deals on tariffs that may lead him to make concessions on other things. So the transactional element of Trump has risks. And two, because of his unease with alliances, which in the Pacific are the absolutely crucial element of American deterrence.
Sam? And then I'm going to come to you on the same question.
I believe, John Bolton wrote that when the president was president and discussed whether he would protect Taiwan, he said no. I mean, I think his record there is clear, and I assume the Chinese have read that. And so I think what's going to happen there is like we've said, quite unpredictable and quite risky.
Sam, as Patrick mentioned, there's been now a continuity over a decade, perhaps, if not longer. I think it continues from Obama's second term, right till Biden White House now, that there has been increasing American pressure on trying to prevent China from ascending both the technological ladder, but also the geopolitical power ladder, right? Is that going to change?
Who is he listening to? Is he listening to the Elon Musks of the world who have significant business interests in China? Is he listening to a more hawkish voice than a Marco Rubio? I think the question is which of those voices is going to carry through, and I think...
On a particular day.
Well, and who speaks last? I mean, he is constantly evolving. And I think that is something to keep in mind. I think it's very hard for anyone to sit here and say, here's what the US-China plan is going to look like 5 years from now.
Okay, Mina.
The economy will be an important part of how Trump looks at China. I think he's less ideological when it comes to certain issues like Taiwan and others that have really dictated sometimes China policy. Marco Rubio is very interesting as Secretary of State, and I think there we'll see some influence. But I do think it will be driven by economic considerations. When it comes, again, EVs from China, this was an issue that, under the Biden administration was pushed out, and there are lots of American companies that are saying, hold on, what are we actually doing here? What does it look like? So I think it will be economically driven. I don't think there's a solid China policy for Trump. So that's one of the unpredictable elements that people are looking towards, and I'm not sure what it will actually end up staying with. But I think also China today is looking different from where we were 5-6 years ago. And so what they're going to be interested in. But I think the technology race is one that is going to be instrumental in that economic conversation.
And since we are with you, Mina, why don't we speak about the energy transitions agenda, the green transitions agenda? How is that going to, in your assessment, pan out under Trump? Is that over? Should we now pack up the green bags and
I think the reality is everybody sees climate change tangibly, and we see it here, gathered here, the levels of snow compared to what we're used to in the Middle East. We absolutely feel the impact of climate change. So I think for countries, be it the UAE or others, who have said, okay, we're serious about this, we need to think about an energy transition, they're very much there. I don't think there's going to be a major reversal. However, will the speed change? Absolutely. What will Trump's approach be when Brazil is hosting COP30 will be really important. And I think actually the
for a number of
reality
reasons.
is, exactly, and the reality is that the energy transition is necessary, but it may get slowed if America gives completely different, incentives to actually let's be thinking about oil. The reality is, though, they have been pragmatic when it comes to some of these issues beyond the bombastic announcement. So we might get something, of
so
course,
there would be some semblance of continuity even in the green transitions. Patrick?
Yeah, I think one of the best guides to Trumponomics is to look at the markets over the last few months, and it gives quite a sophisticated signal about what might happen. So huge surge in small business confidence in America, reflecting the anti-red tape sentiment. Inflation expectations and growth expectations have risen. That's the American animal spirits back in action. On the negative side, more cronyism, favored businesses, including Elon Musk, but some of the crypto players and others, share prices surging, suggesting a kind of oligarchic capitalism, shares of vaccine makers underperforming, showing the kind of strand of anti-science that's there in the Trump agenda. And of course, inflation is a double-edged sword because the market has some alarm about that. And lastly, on the energy side, you know, the oil price has gone up a bit, partly because of concerns over Iran, but renewable energy stock prices have collapsed because people assume that the favorable environment has changed. I mean, I think just on the economy, there are a couple of interesting risks to consider. One is inflation. If expectations rise much more, that's going to start causing a problem for Trump. Two is the fiscal situation in the US, 6% budget deficit. Apparently no one cares, but that's going to come back to bite America at some point. And then lastly, I think for Trump, this strange marriage which you were talking about of the oligarchs and the working American, is it really capable of delivering an economic policy that benefits ordinary Americans who are feeling pretty frustrated about inflation and so on? And those are big question marks that will be answered.
I would just add there are a lot of cyber trucks parked outside Mar-a-Lago right now. And my point is, if for Trump, that energy transition can be reframed as a nationalist cause, as something that benefits the American economy, I don't think he's going to oppose it.
And what is your take on the nexus of these big houses, big business houses, and the blue collar now increasingly voting Trump? How does this relationship pan out?
It's not new for the Republican
that was
Party.
the Democratic Party in some ways, some years ago.
Or, you know, what's the matter with Kansas? I mean, this is a story we've been talking about in different moments of the Republican Party for many years as well. We've seen the debate play out over visas already, right? And Trump stood strongly with the voices that were pro bringing in a certain type of immigration. And so I do think there are going to be these moments of tension. And I think we'll see how this plays out. You see someone like J.D. Vance as someone who's trying to synthesize these two different sets of interests in the Republican Party. And I think important to note what's different about Trump 2.0 versus Trump 1.0. Very soon he's a lame duck. And people like J.D. Vance are going to be people who are going to emerge and try to figure out how are they going to carry forward his vision. Trump didn't have to worry about that at all the first time.
I mean, there's a whole discussion there, and J.D. Vance and his role and future in this administration.
And there's also the midterms, right?
And the midterms that are coming up in 2 years'
the House
time.
of Representatives.
But let me turn to all of you. If someone wants to come in, we have mics here, and we can come to you. Please raise your hands, get our attention, and we'll turn the mic to you to pose some questions. Perhaps we can take...
I think there might be one behind you there.
There's one behind me, there's one here. Everyone is behind me. This is not fair, but anyways, go ahead. So we have a couple of questions here and another one on the side.
Hello, this is Gerard Baker, Swiss Public Television. Thank you for the speech. It was really interesting. My question is very basic. The role, from Trump's perspective, what is the role of Europe? I mean, everybody knows that it was a time when the United States didn't know the phone number for Europe. And recently they said the phone number for Europe is the Prime Minister of Italy. And the Prime Minister of Italy is in Washington right now.
Correct.
And the Commission is not very happy about that. So in the perspective of the United States, what it's in mind? I mean, Europe, is it what for the United States? And what's this destiny?
Can you share the mic with me? Go ahead.
And what is the reality for Africa? What is in the Trump lucky packet for Africa?
And there was a third hand somewhere. It's right here. Can we bring the mic here? Let's take these three questions. Let's bunch them and come to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for this. My question has to do with Latin America. So you mentioned that the U.S. is withdrawing and getting more selective on the regions, and they also mentioned the maximum pressure strategy. So I'm wondering, many people have talked about a return of the Monroe Doctrine in a way, and we're seeing, you know, Marco Rubio in State Department, Mauricio Claver again as an envoy for Venezuela, and, well, all this talk over Canada and the Panama Canal. Also, for example, Edmundo Gonzalez from Venezuela got invited to the Trump inauguration. So I'm wondering, do you see the Trump administration bringing back American focus to South America and Central America, which is an area that has been away from the U.S. main interest since at least the first Bush government, since the free trade agreement of the Americas failed?
Great. So we have three. We want one
You're
more.
going to add a fourth to this?
Okay. Can we add? Can we add one more? Why not? And then we'll quickly go.
Oh, sure.
We'll do a rapid fire.
Mine is it's very, very related.
15 seconds.
Yeah. It's what's the role of the United States in relation, or what's the attitude towards China taking much advantage of this vacancy that the U.S. has experienced in Latin America mainly?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's connected. Final.
So my question is also about the China-U.S. relations, and under Trump, it has become increasingly decoupling from China, including the ban on TikTok and also the tariffs. And what do you think are the factors behind this phenomenon? And how will the tariffs impact the China-U.S. relations? Thank you. Okay,
so we have 5 questions. We have 8 minutes, we have 3 speakers. That's the equation.
Can you solve that equation?
And you have to give me 30 seconds to thank you in the end. 2 minutes each. And you can pick and choose what you want to respond to. And if I think there's an important element that's been left out, I'll come to you. Go ahead.
Well, I can do, why don't I do Europe and tariffs and China? So Europe, problem A is Europe hasn't really got its act together. It's had a long time to do it. The defense situation is still kind of risible, really, in terms of the level of mobilization and coordination to take America's place, if that's required. So that's one thing. So Europe is coming from a position of weakness, which is always bad with Trump. The other thing is we have, notwithstanding your point about Meloni, we have the 2 core engines of Europe, France and Germany, in very difficult political situations, which will rumble on even after the German election as a coalition is built for some time. And I think that makes Europe the vulnerable party here, and that's a bad place to be. On tariffs for China, I think it's priced in already, and you can see the foreign exchange markets have been moving over the last month or two to basically kind of signal that the market's adjusting to a 10 or 20% tariff. Is it helpful? It's really not helpful at all for China, and makes things even worse. And China's ability to restart its economy is one of the central conundrums that will happen over the next few years.
I would take this question and just pull back from it a little bit, which is to say the core of the strength of Trump's rise also sits inside of the weakness, right? So we have these movements for populism. We have a rising China still, despite whatever the kind of concerns are. We have these issues around global migration. We have these issues around climate change. All of that is driving a fury, which is driving Trump to office. And now in 3 hours, they're all his problem. And so all of these concerns about what's going to happen all over the world is no longer something that creates frustration and anger in the American voter, which leads to the election of Trump. It's not something he has to deal with. And so he is both the beneficiary, and now he's going to have to manage all these different questions. And I don't think for very long he's going to be able to say, this is the Biden-Harris administration's problem.
And what about the question on the Monroe Doctrine and the Panama Canal and Greenland and Canada? I mean,
his fascination with Greenland is nearly a decade old. In fact, it's an American fascination. This was discussed in 1947. We thought, well, maybe Greenland looks interesting. It's certainly, the guy loves real estate. He loves, you can't deny, Canada would be nice. And maybe the canal, and I mean, he thinks in that way, and I think he sees the world in a transactional way, and I think that I think we're all laughing about Greenland, and again, we shouldn't be in the predictions business. We're terrible at it, but I think it's a real possibility. I don't think it's completely insane. I think something could happen.
Look, just so that we're clear, Cody designed this panel to set the 3 of you up for failure.
I appreciate that.
3 hours before the inauguration, you 3 are now deciding the next 4 years of the presidency. Best of luck. But no one has yet spoken about the way, and I think that's an important question, Latin America. And the last 3 or 4 years under Biden, it was quite clear, and maybe it preceded Biden, but it was quite clear that China was the most important partner to most Latin American countries. Is it going to change under Trump? And I think that's the point someone was asking. Are we going to see America more engaged with Latin America as a serious geography of strategic importance?
I can't say. I mean, we truly don't know. I don't think there's a consistent view from the administration today about how to approach these problems.
I think the Argentinian role will be important. Clearly, there's a personal relationship there. And Trump thrives on strong personal relationships, and he just thinks, okay, this person can actually help develop that particular region or so forth. But I do think, like Sam, just thinking about the bigger picture, which is international law is incredibly weakened. Security architecture, Ukraine being a big part of that, but there is no real clarity on European security architecture. Security architecture in the Middle East is up in the air at the moment. And for Africa, security is a major issue. And the US has basically said, we're not interested, but also the French have pulled out. So there's a global moment here where Trump is coming, and the unpredictability that Trump represents is also unpredictability of the world. And so, yes, I think it's a very serious moment. And international norms are broken. Nobody can blame Trump for that. I think there are many other dynamics, but the US has played an instrumental role in breaking some of these norms. And as you know, I always will mention Iraq, and I think the Iraq War of 2003 feels like a long time ago. But there's things that have happened in the last 2 decades where it really does feel like there's a moment for a stronger international order, and perhaps one that is more transactional and that is based on, okay, these are national interests, and that's what we're going to go after. And we've seen that's what voters want. And the moment in France and the moment in Germany now is, what does that look like in Europe? But also in Africa, you have African nations saying, okay, well, where are our interests? Because we clearly can't rely on old, partnerships and relationships, be it in Europe. And that's why you see in China, but also in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and other countries around the world having roles in Africa that you couldn't have imagined 30, 40 years ago. So it is a moment of change and unpredictability, and it's not clear what the Trump doctrine will look like, but I think everyone feels like there is a moment for change that's needed.
So a quick question to both of you. Biden administration at the very end saw the importance of investing in connectivity and infrastructure. There was the IMEC arrangement, but there was also an external investment agency created to fund projects in Africa and other parts of the world, to become development actors to prevent losing space in many of these countries. In your opinion, are we going to see America present in those sectors, connectivity, infrastructure, global development sectors, or are we going to see the real estate baron back?
I think...
Go ahead.
America would do well to be involved in those infrastructure projects and think about connectivity. And I think, again, the world is changing. So infrastructure, real estate, yes, but actually you need everything that's around that's going to make sense. However, are there the right people who can actually implement that and see it through in the long term? That's unclear for this administration.
So I think within the US, Trump will repackage all of the Biden industrial policy, and it's going to carry on because it's very much up his street and is about physical assets, which is something Trump places great weight on. America will try and exert more influence over the world economy, but it will not do it through inducement, including the kind of things you were just describing. It will do it through threats and use of coercion, from technology controls to, of course, tariffs. And the desire to influence the world economy is there to a degree, but the tools will be very different from the post-1945 order.
Sam?
This is a moment when everyone is looking inward. And so it's an interesting time to have a conversation about what American leadership looks like at a moment in time when the president-to-be is surrounded by a team that says that's not our problem. And I think it creates, to your point, Mina, they're creating unpredictability through their actions, and they also are rising to power because of that unpredictability.
Great. I think this is a fantastic conversation to kick off Davos 2025. And I think it's an excellent segue to the inauguration that will happen this evening. Thank you. Please thank the wonderful editors for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for joining us.